To understand what it was like to be a Victorian brothel worker, you must first understand what it meant to be born as a poor woman in 19th century Britain. There were no fairy tale beginnings, here only grimy tenements, soot-covered streets, crowded workhouses, and the endless drudgery of poverty that shaped the lives of countless working-class girls. Most women who entered the world of prostitution during the Victorian era didn't choose it so much as they were pushed into it, nudged along by circumstances far beyond their control, by a society that defined them by their usefulness and discarded them the moment they failed to serve. Their stories began not in plush parlor rooms, but in leaking attics, damp cellars, and soot-stained cradles in the poorest corners of London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow. A girl might be born to a laundress who earned pennies washing other people's dirty linens until her hands cracked and bled. Or she might grow up motherless, passed between indifferent relatives, or left to the care of an overworked, underfunded orphanage. Fathers, when present, were often unstable figures, alcoholic dock workers, unemployed craftsmen, or dead by 35 from injury or disease. The average working-class child might share a single mattress with 3 siblings and a flea-bitten blanket that had never truly been clean. Babies died young. Food was scarce. The air reeked of coal smoke and sweat. This was the starting line. School, if attended at all, was not a place for advancement. For poor girls, education ended early, if it started at all. Many were pulled out of school by age 7 or 8 to work cleaning, running errands, or caring for even younger siblings. By 10 or 11, many were placed into the lowest ranks of domestic service. A scullery maid in a boarding house, a chimney sweep's helper, or worse, a matchstick factory girl scraping phosphorus into tiny explosives while slowly poisoning herself with every breath. These were not temporary jobs on a path to something better. These were permanent, back-breaking roles in a life already cornered. The Industrial Revolution, though it brought wealth to cities, created a massive underclass. While the middle and upper classes debated morality in parlors lit by gaslight, a surplus of young women lived in industrial slums, barely scraping by. Women had few rights, no political power, and even fewer protections. Marriage was one option, but it was rarely a rescue. A bad marriage might be worse than no marriage at all. Violent husbands, endless pregnancies, and starvation wages. There was no such thing as a single woman who lived independently with dignity, unless she had family wealth, an unimaginable fantasy for someone. Born in a slum, wages for female laborers were criminally low. A woman might toil for 16 hours in a textile mill and still not earn enough to afford rent, food, and basic clothes. The choices were impossibly narrow. Work yourself to death, marry and risk something worse, or fall quietly, reluctantly into the world of the streets. And once there, society branded you forever. There was no return from it. But sometimes the fall was quicker and more brutal than even that. Orphans made easy prey, so did runaways. So did girls sacked from service. For being disobedient or untrustworthy, often euphemisms for refusing a master's unwanted advances. A girl dismissed from domestic work had few references, fewer options, and no income. She might pawn her last dress, spend the night under a bridge, and finally cold, hungry, and shamed agree to the suggestion of a stranger who offered her money for something she could no longer afford to protect. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't liberating. It was survival. The newspapers, when they mentioned these girls at all, called them fallen women. They spoke as though morality were a slippery ledge and girls simply slipped off due to poor character or weak will. But no paper wrote of the cold nights, the desperation, or the slow, inevitable push that started from birth. There were thousands of girls, nameless in the records, who simply disappeared into the brothels of Victorian cities, some operating openly, some hidden behind false storefronts or private homes. For every famous courtesan with silk gowns and a rich patron, there were hundreds of forgotten workers servicing drunk coal miners for pennies in dark alleyways. Dot family offered no shield. In fact, Family often pushed girls toward the trade. An older sister who had already gone into the life might introduce her younger sibling. A mother might look away. A father, if cruel enough, might sell access outright. There were brothel owners, men and women both, who actively scouted young girls and offered families a lump sum in exchange. Some were outright kidnapped, though. Most were coerced by the quiet violence of starvation and the lack of alternatives. At best, a girl chose the brothel life with full knowledge that the alternative was dying slowly in a workhouse. Even charitable institutions, those meant to offer relief, often failed these women entirely. The workhouses, with their rigid routines and punishments, were prisons in all but name. And religious shelters, while well-meaning on the surface, came with strings attached, forced prayers, moral lectures, and the constant shaming of girls already broken by their circumstances. These institutions rarely offered a meaningful way out. Their goal wasn't to rehabilitate, but to reform, and failing that, to erase. What made it worse was the sheer hypocrisy of the society they lived in. Men of every social class used brothels regularly, even while voting for laws to punish sex workers and attending church services that denounced them. Many of the same politicians who railed against immorality by day were customers by night. Respectable women crossed the street rather than make eye contact with a known working girl, but would never question their own husband's sudden evening absences. Respectability was always a matter of appearances got to be born into poverty. In Victorian Britain was to be born onto a plank narrow, slippery, and aimed toward the sea. Some clung to it desperately their whole lives. Others slipped early. For many young girls, there was no dramatic turning point, no thunderclap decision. That led them to a brothel. It was a slow erosion, one missed meal, one cruel master, one broken promise at a time, until finally, they found themselves standing outside a house with red curtains and candlelight in the window, telling themselves it was just for one night. Doubt it. Never was. The first time was rarely a moment of bold rebellion or dramatic choice. It was often a quiet, exhausted moment, dragged out across days or weeks of mounting desperation. Victorian brothel workers did not wake up one morning and choose the trade with the confidence of a business decision. They arrived at it slowly, through 1,000 little misfortunes, each one pushing them closer to a door they had long hoped to avoid. Their first time was not a moment of empowerment, but an act of survival under the weight of a world that had offered them nothing and demanded everything. For many young women, the journey began with the sudden loss of work. Perhaps they were dismissed from domestic service after being accused of stealing bread or talking back to the mistress. Maybe they fell ill and could no longer stand at a factory loom for 16 hours a day. Or they were dismissed when a pregnancy, unplanned, and often unwelcome, became impossible to hide. Dismissal from employment in the absence of family support or savings was often the beginning of the end. There were no unemployment benefits, no women's shelters, and few employers willing to take on a girl with a spoiled reputation. One by one, doors closed. Once jobless, hunger quickly followed. Landladies were not known for charity. Rent was due weekly, and failure to pay it often meant eviction by force. The streets of cities like London, Liverpool, or Birmingham were filled with women who had nowhere left to go. They pawned dresses, boots, even the family Bible. They begged, they wept, and sometimes, when begging yielded only suspicion or scorn, a man offered them a coin in exchange for something far more private than pity. It might have happened in an alley, or behind a tavern, or on a worn mattress in a rented room with a curtain for a door. That was the first time. Some were lured by promises. A seemingly kind woman might approach a girl in distress and offer her a place to stay for an opportunity to earn a little money. She might talk gently, bring warm tea, offer a place to rest. She would describe the house as respectable, the client as generous, and the work as not so bad once you get used to it. Some brothel madams specialized in recruiting this wayfinding. Girls just desperate enough to believe in small comforts. And the girl, scared but without options, might accept the offer not because it was appealing, but because the alternative was frostbite, hunger, or worse that there were, of course, times that did not involve brothels at all. Street prostitution, also called casual prostitution by the moral reformers of the day, was often the first stop. These women operated without a madam, without protection, and without even the slim benefits that brothel workers received. A girl might start on her own simply because it was the only way to eat that day. She would walk along the shadowed alleys near the docks or railway stations, waiting for a man who wanted what she had to offer. Her first client might be rough. Her payment might be stolen, and there was no guarantee of survival. But hunger has a way of meeting fear. The first time was almost always traumatic. Some girls cried afterward, some dissociated. Some drank gin until their memory blurred, only to wake up unsure of what had just happened. There were no training sessions, no warnings, no safety nets. The men who paid often cared little for consent or kindness. They wanted control or fantasy or simply an outlet for their rage. Many young women entered the trade with a kind of numb resolve, telling themselves it would be temporary. Just one time, just until they could find another job, just until their luck turned. But one time became 2, then 10, then 100. And then it was simply who they were. For others, the path to that first encounter was not desperate, but coerced. Teenage girls, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, were groomed by men who pretended affection, promised gifts, or even marriage. Once isolated from family or friends, the manipulation shifted. These men might sell the girl to a brothel or force her to work the streets on his behalf. Known then and now as pimps, they controlled the money, dictated where the girl lived, and punished her for disobedience. The first time, in these cases, was often a violation wrapped in betrayal, believing someone cared, only to learn you were property dot in some instances. The first encounter was a direct result of prior abuse. Sexual violence within the family was not uncommon in the slums, though rarely discussed. A girl who had already been exploited by her father or uncle might not view her body as something sacred or private. If the world had already taught her that her consent meant nothing, the step into paid sex work was less immoral. Fall and more a continuation of a tragic pattern. No one protected these girls. The shame was placed on them. And in time, some believed the shame belonged to them too. Brothels offered a strange kind of structure. They had rules. They had schedules. There were people to talk to other women who, while often guarded or competitive, at least understood. The madam might take a percentage of every client, but she also provided a bed, basic meals, and sometimes even medical help. For some women, their first time in a brothel felt safer than the streets. The men still came, but there were candles instead of gas lamps, tea instead of rainwater, and doors that locked sometimes. Yet, even in these conditions, the first encounter inside a brothel could be an act of silent endurance, a test of whether the girl could keep herself together long enough to survive. The psychological impact of that first time lingered. Victorian. Society taught women that their worth was tied to their purity. To lose that purity outside of marriage, especially in exchange for money, was to lose one's place in respectable society forever. For many women, the shame was internalized. Even when they were not at fault, they might have been starving. They might have been abused. But still, that first time stained them in the eyes of the world, and often in their own. Even within brothels, the hierarchy depended on experience. New girls, called fresh faces, were often advertised to clients as special, even exotic. Some brothels kept their youngest workers apart, charged higher prices, and lied about their consent. That first encounter, then, was not only personal, but also commercialized, marketed, and sold like a new product. Girls knew it even if they didn't speak of it. Their virginity, whether real or faked, was a selling point. Once spent, it was never mentioned again. Some never made it past that first time. The trauma was too much. They ran, broke down, or simply disappeared. Others hardened, quickly developing the emotional armor they needed to continue. They learned how to fake pleasure, how to flatter, how to make themselves invisible when necessary. The first time became a distant, blurry memory, replaced by the daily mechanics of survival. It was no longer about what had been lost, but what could still be endured. Victorian reformers, in their pamphlets and petitions, often spoke of rescuing women from sin. But rarely did they ask how those women arrived at that place. The first time was not about sin, it was about being cornered, about being denied choices, stripped of safety, and left with a single road forward. That road began with hunger, passed through humiliation, and arrived inevitably, quietly, at a man's bed, a coin in hand, and a slow realization that life would never go back to what it was. If anything had ever been normal to begin with, walking through the door of a Victorian brothel for the first time was not like stepping into some lavish, candlelit fantasy. It was not the red velvet dream that novels hinted at or that men imagined in their whispered conversations. For most women who entered these establishments, the interior was a mixture of illusion and decay, a world where cracked plaster walls were covered with heavy curtains to seem grand, where worn furniture was masked with lace, and where the air smelled faintly of cheap perfume over damp wood and stale gin. Behind the decorative front, brothels were businesses. And like any business, they had a routine, a structure, and strict rules. Victorian brothels varied widely depending on class and location. In the slums of East London or the back alleys of Manchester, a brothel might be little more than a 2-room flat with a few beds. A madam who doubled as cook and enforcer, and 5 or 6 women taking turns between a trickle of customers. These establishments were noisy, cluttered, and often lacked even basic sanitation. There was no plumbing, no heating, and rarely privacy. The beds were shared, the linen rarely changed, and the scent of sweat, candle smoke, and body odor lingered in every corner. Yet even here, there was structure. At the other end of the spectrum were high-end brothels, known as parlor houses, located in quieter, more respectable streets. These were staffed by women who dressed in silks and called themselves companions. The rooms were decorated with mirrors, pianofortes, and long divans. There might be wine served in actual glasses, and clients were expected to behave with a certain veneer of manners. But even in these upper-class brothels, beneath the polish and powder, the life of the women was still one of labor and control. The surroundings may have been prettier, but the rules were just as strict, perhaps stricter. Every brothel had a madam. She was the overseer, the accountant, the rule maker, and the keeper of order. In small houses, she might be a former worker. Herself, one who had retired into management. In larger operations, she might have been trained in bookkeeping with connections to the police and the political underworld. She decided who worked, when they worked, and what they could charge. She took a share of every transaction, sometimes a third, sometimes half, sometimes more. Her word was law. Disobedience could mean a beating, eviction, or worse, yet many of the women depended on her protection. She bribed local constables. She warned them about dangerous clients. She provided, in her own way, a kind of safety net. It always came with a cost. The daily schedule in a brothel was as rigid as in a factory. Women were expected to be up and clean by mid-afternoon, with hair brushed, corsets tightened, and makeup applied. They spent much of the day preparing, washing what they could, sewing torn stockings, and brushing the same few dresses over and over to look fresh. Meals were often communal and plain tea, bread, maybe boiled potatoes if the house was doing. Well, the day's true work began as dusk fell. That was when the front room was lit with oil lamps and candles, when the piano was played, poorly or not at all, and when the clients began to arrive. Clients were greeted in parlors meant to imitate, the drawing rooms of polite society. The furniture was secondhand. The wallpaper was peeling, but it was dressed up with cushions, tassels, and mirrors to create a soft glow that masked the flaws. A few girls would be stationed here, making light conversation, playing music, or pouring drinks. It was part theater, part ritual. The man would choose a girl, sometimes based on looks, sometimes based on mood. Then, either quietly or with a grin, he would follow her upstairs or to the back room. The madam took payment in advance. There were no refunds. The rooms themselves were simple and functional. A bed, a chair, a wash basin if they were lucky. In the higher-end houses, the bedding might be changed once a day. In poorer ones, maybe once a week. The mattress might be stuffed with straw or old rags. There was rarely warmth. The windows were often boarded or covered with heavy cloth to keep out prying eyes, and sometimes the cold. A single candle provided light. There was no music here, no laughter, just the rustle of clothes and the low sounds of business. The brothel was not just a place of work, but a system of hierarchy. New girls were often watched carefully, both by the madam and the other women. Jealousies were common. So were rivalries. If a girl got too much attention, she might be sabotaged, her makeup stolen, her dress accidentally torn. Rumors spread to the madam about her attitude or hygiene. At the same time, women often formed bonds, particularly in the face of violence. If a client became abusive, the others would come running. They shared gin. They shared stories. They watched each other's backs sometimes. But trust was always rationed. Rules were strict and sometimes bizarre. Women were not allowed to speak harshly to clients, no matter how offensive they were. They had to maintain appearances, never refuse a client, unless he was known to be violent. Cleanliness, though nearly impossible in such cramped conditions, was enforced through mandatory weekly baths, often shared or taken with cold water. Dress codes were enforced. Evenings required corsets, gloves, and sometimes costume jewelry to keep up the illusion of desirability. No woman could leave the house without permission. If caught sneaking out or worse, trying to see a client privately, punishment could be swift and brutal. Discipline extended beyond behavior. Fines were common. If a woman broke a rule, she might be docked her earnings for the night. If she spoke out of turn, damaged furniture, or failed to please a client, she might lose privileges like hot meals or private sleeping quarters. The madam controlled not only their work, but their lives, where they slept, what they ate, and how they dressed. There was no such thing as independence in the brothel. Even their names were sometimes chosen for them, exotic or romantic names that sounded better to clients than the common ones they had grown up with, despite these grim conditions. Many women stayed for years. Why? Because the outside world offered even less. The brothel, for all its rot and control, at least provided a roof. It offered food, protection from the worst street dangers, and a strange sense of routine. On some nights, the women laughed together, sang badly, or drank until the misery dulled. They were not free, but they were not alone. And in the cold mathematics of survival, that mattered. Clients often came and went without speaking. Some were quiet. Some were cruel. Others came regularly, seeking the same girl over and over, treating her almost like a mistress, though always on the brothel's terms. The women learned to read men like books, who wanted to be flattered, who wanted to dominate, who wanted to cry. It was emotional labor, unpaid and unnoticed, but it was vital. A mistake could mean bruises. A misread mood could mean worse. Brothels had their own rhythm, their own sounds. The creak of bed springs, the hush of whispered negotiations, the clink of coins passed under the table. They were not places of constant violence or constant glamour. They were mundane, repetitive, and endlessly draining. Women worked through illness, menstruation, and grief. There were no sick days, no privacy, just the next client and the one after that. And yet they endured. Some women managed to save a little money, hidden away in floorboards or behind loose bricks. Some formed quiet friendships with each other. A few found ways to escape, though escape meant becoming someone else entirely, in a different city, with a different name. For the rest, the brothel was not just a workplace. It was their home, their prison, and the only place that hadn't yet turned them out. Inside those walls, the rules were clear. The rot was real. But so was the resilience. For a Victorian brothel worker, there was no such thing as a weekend. No holidays, no time off, no lazy mornings under clean bed sheets. The work was constant and the cycle was unrelenting. If you lived in the brothel, your life followed its rhythms. And if you didn't adapt to the routine, its expectations, its drudgery, and its humiliations, you were cast out like yesterday's bread. The daily grind was not dramatic, nor fast-paced, but instead a slow erosion of spirit. Every day looked much the same as the one before, and the only variation was in the faces of the clients and the increasing toll it took on the body. A typical day began in the late afternoon. The women did not wake with the sunrise because they hadn't gone to bed until long after midnight. In the pale gray light of London mornings, they tried to sleep despite the noise of horses clattering on cobblestones, factory whistles, and crying children in the streets. Sleep came fitfully, if at all. When they did rise, it was to cold water and colder floors. There were no plush rugs or soft slippers. They washed in cracked basins, their faces red from scrubbing. Soap was cheap, sometimes made of lye and ash, and it stung the skin. Yet it was essential. A brothel worker had to be clean or at least seem clean. Appearances mattered. Dressing was an ordeal. There were corsets to be tightened until ribs ached, bustles to be fastened, stockings to be mended with whatever thread could be found. They wore layers even in the heat, their clothes heavy with sweat and perfume. Most of their garments were hand-me-downs from wealthier women, bought secondhand or borrowed from the house. They stitched tears, hid stains, and brushed out wrinkles until everything looked passably decent. A girl might have only one dress that fit properly, and she wore it night after night, dabbing it with lavender water to cover the scent of too many men. Makeup was applied by candlelight powder to pale the skin, rouge for the cheeks, and kohl to line the eyes. It wasn't glamorous. The powders clogged pores. The rouge was made from crushed beetles or toxic chemicals. The kohl contained lead. But looking desirable was part of the job. A brothel worker couldn't afford to look tired, even though exhaustion was permanent. They stared at themselves in cracked mirrors, forcing a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Then they descended into the parlor where the evening would begin. The parlor was the stage. Women lounged on threadbare sofas, flirted, laughed too loudly, and played the roles they'd been given. They poured drinks, sang songs, and flattered clients who fancied themselves romantic or powerful. Some girls played the ingenue, others played the seductress. Some, especially older women, pretended to be wise and mysterious. It was all performance. Behind the painted smiles, they were watching the clock, counting how many hours remained. In the night, and trying to guess whether they would be paid fairly or cheated again. When a client chose a girl, the madam handled the money. Prices varied. Some clients paid extra for privacy, for special requests, or for extended time. The women rarely saw the full amount. A cut went to the house. Another went to cover their food, their clothes, their candles. There were fines for lateness, for rudeness, for having a bad attitude. By the time a woman collected her share, she might be left with a few shillings, barely enough for a proper meal, let alone savings. But she smiled anyway, led the client upstairs, and pretended not to see the cracks in the ceiling, or the bed frame that creaked with every step. The act itself was mechanical. There was no pleasure, no romance. A brothel worker learned to detach, to stare at the wall, to fake moans if necessary. Some men were quick and silent. Others were rough and demanding. Some cried. Some struck. Some never took off their boots. The women endured it because resistance brought punishment. They kept track of the time, watched the candle burn low, and waited for the man to finish. Then they cleaned up, changed the sheets if there were clean ones available, and returned to the parlor to wait again. The night continued like this. Sometimes 3 clients, sometimes 5. On busy nights, more. On quiet ones, hours passed in silence and tension. The women might play cards, braid each other's hair, or nap in corners until the bell rang again. There was a little camaraderie. Friendships formed, but they were fragile, easily broken by jealousy, money, or fear. Everyone was trying to survive, and survival didn't leave much room for trust. There were fights. There were tears, but most of the time there was just silence. Meals were simple. Tea, if available. Stale bread. A bit of cheese. The madam sometimes provided soup or boiled potatoes, depending on how much profit had been made that week. Alcohol was more plentiful. Gin was cheap and effective. It dulled the pain, blurred the memories, and made the nights go faster. Some women drank to forget. Others drank because it was expected. A tipsy girl might seem more charming, more willing. But too much gin, and she'd be punished, or worse. There was a line. They walked it every night. By the early hours of morning, the clients thinned out. Some women collapsed into bed immediately. Others stayed awake, too wired or too shaken to sleep. The rooms were cold. Blankets were thin. Sleep, when it came, was filled with dreams they didn't want to remember. And by the time the sun rose again, the cycle had already started to turn once more. The daily grind was not one of adventure or even overt tragedy. It was monotony. It was repetition. It was the slow fading of self beneath routine. The women lost track of time. Monday blurred into Thursday. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Some left, some vanished. Some died quietly in their rooms, found days later by the madam or another worker. Their names forgotten. Their routines inherited by the next girl. And the one after her there were moments of laughter, small flashes of humanity amid the grind. A joke over breakfast, a story shared while lacing up a corset, a song hummed softly while brushing hair. These moments did not erase the misery, but they softened it, however briefly. The women clung to these scraps of life because they were all they had. For the Victorian brothel worker, life was a loop: wake, wash, dress, perform, serve, repeat. Each day was a test of endurance, and every night a gamble with dignity and health. There were no breaks, no promotions, no applause, just the grind, and it never really ended. A brothel worker's world was shaped not just by the walls she lived within, or the women she shared her space with, but also sometimes entirely by the men who passed through those walls each night. They came in every imaginable form: old, young, clean-shaven or crusted with grime, polite or rude, generous or cruel. Some came out of boredom, some out of loneliness, and some because they knew no other way to feel powerful. And though each man walked through the brothel doors with the same objective in mind, their reasons, their behaviors, and the aftermath they left behind were as varied as their boots and collars. The clients of Victorian brothels formed an astonishing cross-section of society. One might assume they were all brutish men from the working class, slouching in from the docks or emerging drunk from gin shops. And there were plenty of those. Laborers with soot under their nails and ale on their breath, spending their weekly wages for 10 minutes of escape. They were blunt, often rough, but in many cases predictable. They arrived, paid quickly, finished faster, and disappeared without ceremony. They didn't linger. They didn't talk. They were not cruel so much as indifferent. For the brothel worker, they were often the least troubling to handle, easy to read, and unlikely to overstay their welcome. But beyond them were others, middle-class clerks in fraying suits who had grown tired of routine. These were the men who wore respectability like a badge during the day, filing papers, managing ledgers, overseeing accounts, and by night sought out places where they could be someone else. They came with the cautious look of men who feared being seen, who mumbled their names or gave false ones entirely. They often insisted on particular girls, on privacy, on silence. Many wanted conversation more than sex. They confessed their frustrations, their small dreams, their unhappiness. In marriage, for a woman trained to listen, this could be even more exhausting than a client who simply wanted to get on with it. The wealthy came, too. The gentlemen with polished shoes and silk cravats. The ones who paid well but expected to be entertained. Like royalty, these were the dangerous ones, not always physically, but morally. They wanted the illusion of control, and often the illusion of virtue. even as they indulge in what society deemed sin. They played games, they tested limits, they came with expectations, sometimes demanding elaborate roleplay, sometimes asking for degrading acts with a soft voice and a hard hand. They were not loud, but they could be cruel in ways the laborer never dreamed of. And they had the money to buy silence afterward. Politicians, soldiers, lawyers, men of high position were regular visitors. And everyone in the brothel knew better than to speak of them outside. Their presence was an open secret. A judge might sentence a woman for lewd behavior during the day, and that same night arrive at her brothel with a mask of piety barely clinging to his face. These clients paid for more than the service. They paid for discretion. The madam ensured it. The women understood that revealing their identities could bring ruin, not to the men, but to themselves. A brothel worker could disappear overnight. If she spoke too freely, then there were the lost ones. Men who came not for sex, but for something far sadder. Widowers who hadn't touched a woman since their wives had died. War veterans haunted by memories they couldn't voice to anyone else. Lonely old men who just wanted to hold hands and speak softly for an hour. They often paid full price for a companion who would listen, perhaps let them cry. These clients, for all their strangeness, were often easier to endure. They didn't ask much. Just a kind face, a warm voice, and someone to share a moment with. But even these moments took their toll. A brothel worker couldn't afford to get too close, too soft. Compassion had to be managed carefully. There were too many stories and too little energy to carry them all. Some men were violent. There was no way to predict who would be. A calm exterior could hide a temper that flared at the smallest rejection. If a woman didn't smile the right way, if she said no, if she showed too much fatigue, these could all be triggers. Fists flew, voices rose, and sometimes worse. The brothel, supposedly a place of safety, was only as safe as the madam's willingness to eject a paying customer. Some madams did. Others turned a blind eye if the man paid well enough. The women knew which clients to fear. They whispered warnings to each other, but sometimes it wasn't enough. Requests varied. Some men came in with strange fantasies, wanting the woman to dress like a widow, or a schoolgirl, or pretend to faint. Some asked to be insulted. Others asked for silence. There were rules in most brothels, nothing involving children. Nothing. That drew blood, but rules bent under money. The more a man paid, the more rules he could push. The women learned to nod, smile, and get through it. Their bodies were currency, and each transaction came with terms they had little power to change. Some clients returned regularly. These were regulars, and could be both a blessing and a burden. A regular might be kind, even affectionate. He might bring gifts, flowers, sweets, perfume. He might treat the woman like a lover, call her by a pet name, act as though they shared something real. This blurred the line between business and emotion. And once that line blurred, the danger grew. Because when a regular left found a wife, moved away, lost interest, it hurt in a way a one-time client never could. For many brothel workers, the worst pain was not from violence or exhaustion, but from being briefly treated as human, and then abandoned thought there were rules about how to speak to clients. Brothel workers were taught not to provoke, not to speak out of turn. Some men wanted to be dominant, others submissive. The women became experts at reading tone, posture, and mood. A twitch of the eye, a tightening of the jaw. These signs were like storm clouds on the horizon. Knowing how to adapt, how to soothe or entertain was as much a part of the job as anything else. And when things went wrong, they went wrong fast. No training prepared them for that. Only experience. For all their differences, the clients had one thing in common: they left. After their needs were met, after their money was spent, they buttoned their coats, adjusted their hats, and walked back into a world where they could pretend the night had never happened. They returned to wives, to clubs, to offices. They spoke of morality, of public decency, of the value of women. And the brothel workers remained behind heavy curtains and locked doors, cleaning up the mess, putting on their paint again, and waiting for the next knocked out. Not every client was evil. Not every visit was traumatic. But the accumulation of encounters night after night, month after month, wore away at the soul. Each man took a little something: dignity, energy, illusion, and none gave it back. This was the parade the women saw nightly. A steady march of the bored, the broken, the desperate, and the cruel. It never stopped. It never changed. And through it all, the brothel workers endured, because they had no choice behind the dimly lit parlors. The rouge-stained cheeks and the rustling of petticoats. Brothel life in Victorian Britain was stalked by something far more persistent than any cruel client: disease. It slipped through the keyholes, lived in the creases of bed sheets, and hid beneath the powder that masked the paleness of the skin. Illness was everywhere, in the walls, in the water, in the air. It was a quiet killer, not always swift, but always present. For a brothel worker, disease wasn't just a threat. It was an inevitability. The most feared of all diseases was syphilis. It was known grimly as the pox, or the French disease, though its name shifted depending on who the British wanted to blame at the time. In its early stages, syphilis caused small sores and ulcers, often mistaken for something harmless. But as it progressed, it became a monster rotting flesh, eating into bones, dulling the eyes, and eventually stealing the mind. It caused madness, it caused deformity, it caused death. But worse, it moved in silence for weeks or even months before its symptoms became obvious. A woman might work for months with no idea she carried it, passing it on or letting it devour. Her from the inside out, there was no cure. Not really. Mercury was the most common treatment, administered as pills, ointments, or even inhaled as vapor. But mercury itself was poisonous. Patients who underwent treatment sometimes lost their teeth, their hair, or even their sanity, not from the disease, but from the cure. A woman faced with a syphilis diagnosis was often faced with a choice: do nothing and let the illness consume her slowly, or take mercury and risk a quicker, more miserable decline. Most chose to keep working until their bodies gave out, and syphilis was only one of many threats. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, and other infections ran rampant. The concept of germs was not yet fully accepted, and many doctors still believed in bad air or imbalanced humors. Prostitutes were often blamed as the source of disease, but rarely were their clients held accountable. In fact, clients could and often did bring infections from brothel to brothel, spreading sickness like wildfire. Yet when laws were passed to control this, they did not target the men. They targeted the women. The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in the 1860s, gave police the right to detain any woman suspected of prostitution and force her to undergo invasive medical examinations. If found to be infected, she could be confined to a locked hospital for months, even years without trial. No such law existed for the men who spread the same diseases. For the women, it was humiliation wrapped in policy. The exams were often painful, conducted without consent, and performed in unsanitary conditions. Many women left these institutions, worse off than when they entered. Some brothels attempted to manage disease themselves. Madams who wanted to keep their girls working and thus earning might inspect them regularly, or insist they visit doctors. But most were not so concerned. If a woman grew ill, she might simply be dismissed. There was always another girl waiting to take her place. Sickness was inconvenient. It slowed the flow of profit. And in the end, a sick girl was less useful than a healthy one. The house moved on without her. Outside the brothel, life wasn't much better. Hospitals were overcrowded, underfunded, and suspicious of prostitutes. Nurses might refuse to touch them. Doctors might sneer or offer only the barest help. Charity organizations occasionally took in sick brothel workers, but often only after long lectures and promises to reform. The women, desperate for care, sometimes accepted this, though the help came with strict rules, religious demands, and an unspoken understanding that they were being forgiven for something they hadn't chosen in the first place. Tuberculosis or consumption was another silent killer. It spread through coughs, thrived in damp, crowded environments, and wasted the body slowly. It was called the romantic disease by the upper classes, but in the brothel, it was just another way to die. Women who coughed too much, who grew too thin, who sweated through their clothes at night, were watched with nervous eyes. They were still expected to work. Rest was a luxury. A bed in the sick room meant lost income. So they worked until they collapsed, and even then were sometimes propped up again with gin and powder. Made to look alive just a little longer. Pregnancy was its own kind of danger. Contraception was unreliable at best. Condoms existed, made of animal intestines and tied with ribbon, but they were expensive, uncomfortable, and usually insisted upon by the women, not the men. Withdrawal, douching, herbal remedies, these were the methods available, none of them effective. When a brothel worker became pregnant, it was rarely a happy occasion. Some tried to continue working into the later months, their swelling bellies, hidden under layers of fabric. Others sought abortions, which were illegal and highly dangerous. Back alley procedures were performed with knitting needles. Poisons or crude tools by women who claimed to know what they were doing. Many did not. Infection, hemorrhage, and death were common. A woman who survived such an ordeal might be rendered infertile. Others bled to death in silence, their names never recorded, their bodies buried in paupers' graves. The madam would find a replacement. The clients would return as usual. Nothing changed. Mental illness was everywhere and nowhere. There were no therapists, no understanding of trauma. Women who began to break down, who cried too much, who talked to themselves, who refused to work were seen as troublesome. They were drugged with laudanum or gin. Some were beaten back into obedience. Others were dismissed, their belongings thrown into the street. A brothel could not afford a mad woman. She frightened clients. She lowered the mood. So she was pushed out and forgotten. Suicide was not uncommon. It rarely made the newspapers. A girl who jumped into the Thames or who hung herself in her room was a brief mention in a police report, if that. The law viewed suicide as a crime. So did the church. Bodies were sometimes denied burial in consecrated ground. The other women in the brothel might mourn quietly, or they might not. They had to move on. There were still clients, still rooms to prepare, still powder to apply to the face. Grief was a luxury they could not afford. There were no monuments to these women. No memorials for the hundreds, perhaps thousands who died quietly from disease, from violence, from despair. Their names vanished, their stories forgotten. The brothels continued. The clients returned. The streets remained busy. And behind it all, the cost of the trade, the real grinding, bodily cost was paid in silence. What made it all worse was the hypocrisy of the society that ignored them in life and judged them in death. The same men who visited nightly whispered prayers over their coffins. The same papers that advertised brothels in secret columns condemned fallen women in editorials. And the same government that refused them medical care blamed them for the spread of illness. For the brothel worker, disease was not an abstract fear. It was a daily companion. It lived in their bones, in their breath, in the warm flush on their cheeks that never seemed to fade. It was in the tremble of their hands, in the fevered sleep, in the slow decay of health that no amount of rouge could cover. They endured it all silently, endlessly, because there was no one to listen. And because survival, however short, still beat the alternative. The law was not something that protected Victorian brothel workers. It was something that hovered over them like a predator in uniform. A shadow that watched and judged and punished but never shielded. For women who lived and worked in brothels, the legal system wasn't a distant part of society. It was a looming daily threat. It didn't matter whether they were mistreated by clients, cheated by madams, or robbed in the street. The law wasn't on their side. The law, in almost every case, was something they avoided, feared, and endured. Officially, prostitution was not illegal in Victorian. That is to say, there was no single law that said a woman could not sell sex. But this technicality didn't matter much in practice. The system found other ways to make life unbearable. Brothel keeping was illegal. Soliciting was illegal. Loitering with intent was illegal. Causing a public nuisance, a vague and catch-all term, was illegal. So, while a woman could technically sell her body behind closed doors, the moment she did so in view of a street, a police officer, or a disapproving neighbor, she became a criminal. And that's exactly how society preferred it. Respectable people wanted the women hidden, silent, invisible, but still accessible. They were judged not for the work itself, but for the inconvenience of being seen. If a brothel became too obvious, too noisy, too scandalous, too close to middle-class homes, the police would raid it. Not to help the women inside, but to preserve appearances. Women were arrested, paraded in court, fined or imprisoned, then released back into poverty to start the cycle all over again. Police officers had enormous power over these women, not just as enforcers of the law, but as arbiters of who got left alone and who got dragged off in irons. Many officers took bribes, gifts, or services in exchange for looking the other way. A brothel might survive for years untouched as long as the local constable was paid regularly. If that arrangement broke down or if the Madame lost favor raids could be swift and merciless. And for the women, there was no appeal. Complaining to the police about a crooked officer was a quick route to ruin. Even when the police didn't come with handcuffs, their presence loomed. A woman walking the street, even just to buy bread or fetch water, could be stopped, questioned, or arrested on the suspicion that she was of immoral character. That phrase, so vague and so powerful, was enough to justify imprisonment. If a man accused a woman of propositioning him, her word meant nothing. She could be locked away based on hearsay, her clothes, or reputation. Once arrested, the court process was humiliating. Women were dragged before magistrates, often still in the clothes they'd been wearing when seized, sometimes bruised, sometimes half-dressed. Their names were read aloud, their supposed crimes listed. Reporters often stood in the courtroom, scribbling it all down for the next morning's newspapers. There was no privacy, no mercy. Fines were issued. If a woman couldn't pay, and most couldn't, she was sent to prison. There she might spend weeks or months in a cell, sleeping on straw, eating meager rations, scrubbing floors as penance. And what did she learn from prison? That the system hated her, feared her, and needed her gone. It didn't reform her. It didn't offer new work or training or aid. She was released into the same world that had betrayed her before, only now with a criminal record, and even fewer options than before. Then came the Contagious Diseases Acts, a set of laws designed, supposedly, to control the spread of venereal diseases among the British Army and Navy. But in practice, they targeted poor women in garrison towns and port cities. Under these acts, a police officer could detain any woman suspected of prostitution and compel her to submit to a physical examination. No trial, no warrant, just suspicion. If she was found to have an infection, she could be confined to a locked hospital for treatment, often against her will. If she refused the exam, she could be imprisoned. These examinations were traumatic. Women were subjected to invasive procedures by male doctors, often in degrading conditions. There was no concern for consent or dignity. They were treated like diseased animals, not human beings. The men who infected them, meanwhile, remained entirely untouched by the law. A soldier could visit a brothel, contract syphilis, and walk away with no consequence. The woman, however, was monitored, detained, and controlled by the state. Resistance did exist. Women like Josephine Butler, a fierce social reformer, led campaigns to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts. She traveled the country, spoke in Parliament, wrote articles, and gave voice to the thousands of silenced women who had suffered under these laws. Her efforts and those of her allies eventually led to the acts being repealed in 1886. But for many women, the damage had already been done. Even outside of formal law, brothel workers lived without justice. If they were assaulted by a client, who would they tell? The police? A judge? No one believed them. And even if someone did, prosecuting the man often required the woman to testify in court, publicly naming herself as a prostitute, a mark that would follow her for the rest of her life. Most chose to remain silent. Others dealt with it themselves, fighting back with whatever was at hand, a candlestick, a shoe, their fingernails. But often there was no fight left in them. Madams were not always fair or kind. Some ruled with fear. They withheld pay. They locked women in rooms. They sold them to other houses. They took more than their share, but what could a girl do? If she ran away, she might be homeless. If she reported her madam, she might be arrested herself. The law had no room for the complaints of a prostitute. Even death offered little dignity. If a brothel worker died violently murdered by a client or beaten to death, there might be a brief stir in the papers. Another fallen woman, they'd say, a tragic end. But there was rarely a real investigation. Her life was summed up in one sentence. Her death attributed to bad choices and the man responsible. If caught, he might serve a few years. If not, he walked free, the world unwilling to punish him for the crime of killing a woman who was already seen as tainted. The Victorian justice system was designed to protect the moral order, not the people. And for women in brothels, that meant living outside the bounds of protection entirely. They were visible when society wanted to punish them, invisible when they needed help. Every part of the system, from the street patrol to the courtroom, reinforced the idea that they did not deserve safety, rights, or respect. And so they made their own forms of justice. They warned each other. They shared names of dangerous clients. They hid money in floorboards. They watched out for the girl who cried too much, who drank too much, who looked like she might not last another week. Because no one else would. The law did not serve them, so they served each other, in whispers and silence, behind locked doors, and then the next night came. And the next, and still, they endured. For the women who worked in Victorian brothels, life was not just about endurance, it was about survival. But survival, day after day, under the weight of exploitation, exhaustion, and fear, demanded more than a strong back or a steady hand. It required escape, even if that escape was only temporary. And so, behind the powder and rouge, beneath the tight-laced corsets and the routines of their profession, many women turned to anything that could take them away just for a little. While addiction was a quiet epidemic among brothel workers, not always visible and rarely talked about outside the closed world of brothel, but deeply rooted in their everyday lives. The most common escape came in the form of gin cheap, strong and everywhere. Gin was the unofficial medicine of the poor. It was liquid courage, liquid numbness, and for many, liquid silence. A few swallows dulled the body, a few more dulled the mind. It softened the harsh edges of cruel clients, masked the hunger that came from missed meals, and blurred the memory of the man from last night who'd been too rough, too angry, too. Strange, it was also encouraged. Madam sometimes provided gin to keep their girls compliant and calm. A tipsy girl didn't complain. A tipsy girl was easier to manage. Some women drank before every client. Others saved it for afterward, as a kind of ritual, something to swallow the shame or the fatigue. And then, before long, they needed it just to feel normal. Their bodies adjusted. The shakes began when they went too long without it. The headaches pounded, and the only relief was another glass. Gin was a blanket, soaked in poison. It helped them sleep. It helped them forget. But it also stole years from them faster than any client ever could, beyond alcohol. There was laudanum, a liquid mixture of alcohol and opium that came in small brown bottles and was sold freely in chemist shops. No prescription needed. Was advertised as a cure for everything from cramps to coughs to female complaints. And for brothel workers, it was a miracle. It quieted the nerves. It dulled the pain. It soothed the bleeding and the bruises and the endless, howling thoughts that came when the candles were blown out and the world went silent. But laudanum was addictive. In a way few understood at first, a single dose might bring peace. But it Took a little more the next time, and then a little more. Until one day, the woman who once danced in the parlor with painted cheeks was found curled in a corner, shaking and sweating, her hands wrapped around a bottle she couldn't afford, but couldn't stop buying. Some women live like that for years, walking ghosts in corsets, eyes glassy, smiles mechanical. Others simply didn't wake up one morning. Their hearts slowed to a stop by a few drops, too many dot. Not all escapes were chemical. Some were imaginative. The fantasy of freedom was a powerful drug of its own. Women told stories to one another, sometimes while dressing, sometimes while undressing, about the day they would leave the brothel. I'm saving up, one might say, stuffing coins into a slipper beneath the floorboard. Just a few more months and I'll be gone. Another might talk about opening a dress shop, or becoming a maid in a quiet village, or sailing to America where no one knew her name. The plans were real, or they felt real at least in the telling. Even if the coins were spent the next day on bread, or on a doctor's visit, or taken by the madam. Even if America was just a place someone had read about once, the dream mattered. It gave them something to hold on to when the nights were long and the clients were cruel. Hope, even hollow hope, was a kind of escape. And sometimes, though not often, one of them did get out. But escape was not simple. There were very few paths open to women with no money, no family support, and a reputation that clung like soot. A woman who left the brothel was often refused by employers once her past was known. References mattered in Victorian England, and brothel workers didn't have them. They couldn't apply for respectable jobs. They couldn't rent rooms in good neighborhoods. They couldn't walk into churches without whispers following them down the pews. Some tried to go straight and ended up working in laundries for pennies, collapsing in heat and steam and soapy water, wondering if it was really freedom at all. Marriage was another hoped-for escape, though it came with its own chains. Some clients promised to rescue their favorite girl, offering a ring, a new home, a new name, and sometimes they meant it. But often they didn't. The promise dissolved with morning light. Or worse, the man married her and then treated her like property, ashamed of what she had been, punishing her for the very thing he had once paid for. Brothel workers who married out of their profession were often isolated, stripped of friends and constantly reminded of their fallenness. Respectable society had a long memory. It forgave slowly, if at all. Others found religion or were pulled into it by reformers. Churches ran Magdalene homes for so-called fallen women, where prostitutes could seek redemption and shelter, but at a price. Their hair was cut. Their clothes replaced with drab uniforms. Their days were filled with prayer and laundry, repentance and silence. Some found comfort in this structure, the chance to be someone else. Others felt imprisoned again, traded one set of rules for another. And in both cases, the world outside still remembered who they had been. Very few women wrote about their own escapes. Fewer still were given the chance. Most vanished quietly. If they did leave the brothel, they did so anonymously, walking into the fog with a bundle of clothes and a bruised heart. Some were never heard from again. And yet the brothel continued. Another girl took her place. The room stayed warm. The mirror kept catching new faces, and for those who remained, the escape became more and more imaginary. The bottle stayed closer to the bed. The laudanum dropper clinked softly in the basin. The stories about sailing away became bedtime tales, told more for comfort than belief. Hope, like everything else, was rationed, but the longing never left. No matter how many years a woman spent inside the brothel, no matter how deeply she had sunk into addiction or despair, there was always a small, quiet voice that whispered, maybe there's still time. Maybe one more client. Maybe one more? Payday. Maybe someone would love her, see her, carry her away. Most of them never found out. But they kept the fantasy alive, because sometimes, when the world gave you nothing else, dreaming was the only way to stay human. The brothel was not a place of solitude. It was not just a room or a bed or a locked door. It was a hive of women dozens, sometimes more, living side by side, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. And within that closeness grew a complicated, shifting world of sisterhood and rivalry. These women weren't just co-workers. They were competitors, housemates, friends, enemies, confidants, and strangers all at once. Their relationships were forged in fire tempered by hardship, dulled by repetition, and polished by necessity. They were each other's mirrors, sometimes painfully so. The brothel was filled with constant reminders of age, beauty, popularity. A woman could not help but compare herself to the others. Who got the most clients? Who had the finest dress? Who was the madam's favorite? These silent questions shaped everything, from how they curled their hair to how they sat in the parlor. Competition was built into the structure of the house. There were only so many clients, only so many good nights. To get ahead meant someone else fell behind. And yet, amid all that, there was sisterhood too, a deep, quiet one. A kind that few, outside the brothel, could understand. Because no one else knew what it was like to wake up sore and aching. To paint a smile on a tired face, to hold back tears while a stranger grunted overhead. Only the women within those walls knew that rhythm. Only they understood the weight of those evenings. The way time stretched in silence when the client left and you sat still in the after. There was no need to explain the pain. They just knew. And sometimes knowing was enough. They braided each other's hair. They mended ripped seams. They shared powder and perfume, rolled stockings, swapped corset laces when someone's broke. They passed down tricks, how to deal with a rough client, how to fake enthusiasm, how to make a single cup of tea stretch for two. The older ones guided the younger ones, though not always gently. Don't trust that one, they'd say. Watch how he looks at you. Say no, he wants the second floor. The bed slants. It wasn't always warm. There were sharp words too. Fights over clients or stolen money or bruised pride. Jealousy was everywhere. If one girl was favored, the others felt it. And when someone was new and pretty and full of false hope, the older women might turn cold, unwilling to watch yet another try and fail to escape. Alliances formed and shifted quickly. One week's confidant could become next week's competitor. A whispered secret became a shouted insult. A shared meal became an accusation. But beneath the pettiness, most knew the truth. They were all. In the same sinking boat dot in many brothels, women slept in shared quarters. Privacy was rare. Beds creaked. Snores filled the night. Someone was always coughing. Someone was always weeping. The room smelled of sweat, gin, soap, and something darker that no one named. But even in that crowded quiet, there were gestures of care. A hand on a shoulder, a murmured joke. A blanket passed from one cot to another. There was an unspoken code. Don't ask too many questions. Don't judge too harshly. And never ever laugh at someone else's brokenness. Sometimes they sang old songs from childhood. Popular tunes half remembered from the street. The sound drifted up the stairs and into the rooms where men paid to forget the world. The singing reminded the women that they were still people. Still more than what the world saw them as. Sometimes they told stories about lives before, about mothers they missed, about the children they'd had to leave behind. Most had someone out there they never spoke of unless the night was especially long. There were in-jokes and nicknames. A girl with red hair might be called Flame. A shy one Mouse. They laughed together because laughter was rebellion. Laughter said, I'm still here. Laughter said, you haven't taken everything yet. These small moments of joy shared around cracked teacups and candlelight were tiny. Resistances against the drudgery of their lives. A kind of invisible armor, but sisterhood had its limits. When food was scarce, when rent was due, and the madam threatened to throw someone out, that solidarity could fracture. It was easier to point fingers than to lose your bed. Easier to whisper about someone else than to risk being the next to go. And madams knew this. They used it. They played favorites. They sowed distrust. A compliment here, a punishment there, until the women were always on edge, watching each other instead of the real enemy. Some women left. Some vanished in the night. Some were sold to other houses. Some died. When that happened, the mood shifted. A strange silence would settle. her bed left unmade, her name not spoken for a day or two. The others went about their work, quieter than usual. And then, just as quickly, the rhythm returned, because it had to, because the brothel didn't stop. A new girl arrived. The bed was filled, and the memory faded like perfume in the hallway. Occasionally, one of them really did get out. She married a client, or found work in a laundry, or entered a religious home and stayed. These stories became part cautionary tale, part legend. Remember Alice? She's got a shop now. Mary's a wife in Surrey. Rose never wrote, but I heard she got out. The stories might be true, or not, but they served a purpose. They kept the hope alive, even if it was thin and frayed, inside the brothel. The women learned to survive together, not as a family, not always as friends, but as fellow inmates in a strange prison with velvet curtains and gilded mirrors. They didn't always like each other, but they understood each other. And that counted for something. In the end, what bound them wasn't kindness or affection. It was knowledge. The kind of knowledge that came from pain shared, from lives that ran parallel in too many sad ways. They might fight. They might cry. They might curse each other. But when a girl didn't come back from a client's room, they were the ones who noticed first. When someone was too quiet, they were the ones who knocked. When someone fell apart, they didn't ask questions. They just helped her stand up again, because in a world that hated them, that called them dirty, fallen, and less than human, the only people who saw their worth were the ones beside them. And that kind of sisterhood, rough and bruised as it was, might have been the only real comfort they ever knew. In the strange, dim world of the Victorian brothel, no figure loomed larger nor more ambiguously than the madam. She was the constant presence, the one whose footsteps echoed through the corridors, the one who held the keys, quite literally, to the women's lives. She was gatekeeper, housekeeper, employer, jailer, guardian, negotiator, and sometimes, though not often, confidant. To many of the girls, she was both their shield and their sword. A woman wrapped in lace and hard eyes, who knew every secret and controlled every coin. Becoming a madam wasn't something most little girls dreamed of. Like the women who worked under her, she had often started out as one of them. She had been a girl once young, frightened, learning how to survive the nightly rhythm of strangers and sweat and silence. She had served the same kinds of men, worn out the same shoes, stained the same pillows. But somehow, through luck, cunning, or sheer endurance, she had climbed out of the bed and into the chair behind the ledger. She had taken control. At least that's how it looked. The madam's job was far more than sitting pretty and collecting fees. She managed everything. The rent, the bills, the bribes to local constables, the food, the laundry, the candles, the repairs to creaky staircases and broken locks. She chose the girls. She hired them, sometimes from the street, sometimes through whispers passed along alleys or among other madams, and she could dismiss them just as quickly. Her word was law. If she said a girl was too slow, too lazy to, troublesome, out she went. No appeal, no second chances. She also kept track of every coin, every transaction. The fees were often split, though never evenly. A client might pay a shilling, but the woman who performed the service would only see a portion of it, maybe half, maybe less. The rest went to the house, for the bed, for the soap, for the heat, for the privilege of working in safety, or at least the appearance of it. And the madam made sure the books were always balanced in her favor. There were charges for everything. If a woman broke a comb or stained a sheet, it went on her debt. If she wanted medicine or a new corset, she had to borrow. Many women worked for years and never saw a clear profit, just a running tally in the madam's ledger. Always slightly in the red, and yet she provided stability. In a world where nothing lasted, the madam made sure the roof stayed in place, and the doors locked at night. She kept the worst of the clients out sometimes. She could throw out a man who raised his hand. She could refuse a drunk. She could insist on payment before service. If the brothel had rules, she enforced them. If the house had any scrap of dignity, it came from her efforts to keep it so. But not all madams were kind. Some were ruthless. They yelled, they humiliated, they controlled with cold precision. A girl who defied them could find herself locked out, her belongings gone, her place given to another, others manipulated. They offered affection, approval, whispered praise, only to twist the knife later. They kept their girls' clothes not out of care, but out of control. Some even sold them, traded them to other brothels, or lent them to powerful clients as favors. A woman in a madam's good graces might be protected. A woman who fell from favor might be destroyed. Many madams walked a delicate line with the law. To the police, they were informants. If a brothel stayed open too long, too publicly, the local constables would come knocking. To avoid arrest, madam might pass along information about rival houses, about particular clients, about which girls had caused trouble in the streets. It was a quiet, ugly game, and it often turned the women in the house against one another. She told the madam you were late. She said you stole from the till. Rumors spread like smoke. The madam listened to all of them, but rarely let her thoughts be known until the moment she made a decision. And when she did, it was final dot in some cases. Madams had connections in higher places. They paid off city officials. They had friends in publishing or politics. They ensured the house was left alone in exchange for favors, sexual, financial, or both. Some even hosted gentlemen's evenings, lavish affairs with velvet curtains and wine, where the clients were not just dock workers and clerks, but judges and doctors and MPs. In these places, the madam dressed like royalty. She watched from her parlor window, her expression unreadable, as the girls took men upstairs. She knew every name. She knew every secret. And that power in a society where women had so little was rare and dangerous, but that power had limits. A madam could fall just as easily as she rose. If her house was raided, if her debts piled too high, if one of her girls died under suspicious circumstances, if the constable she paid was replaced by another, there were no guarantees. And many madams, once respected, ended up on the streets themselves, older, forgotten, muttering to themselves about the days when their rooms were full and their name meant something. Some madams were motherly. They gave advice, patched wounds, held a girl's hand when she cried. They taught survival, how to choose clients, how to fake pleasure, how to spot disease. Some even tried to help their girls leave the trade, though it was rare. Others ruled. By fear, they kept ledgers tighter than iron bars. They spoke with sharp tongues. They remembered every slight and never forgave. The brothel reflected its madam, whether cold and efficient, warm and chaotic, or cruel and brittle dot to the outside world. The madam was often seen as worse than her girls. Society painted her as a corrupter, a woman who profited from sin, who dragged others down with her. But that view ignored the complexity of her role. She was not a villain, not exactly. She was a product of her world, same as the rest. A woman who learned to climb the only ladder available to her, even if she had to step on others to reach the top. She had survived. And survival came with a price. For the women who lived under her roof, she remained a figure of endless tension. They feared her, relied on her, resented her, and sometimes even loved her. She was not their friend. She was not their enemy. She was something in between. A woman hardened by the same fire, but standing just slightly outside the flame. And when they spoke of her late at night, in whispers, they used her name like a spell. Because she was the one who decided whether they stayed warm or were thrown out into the cold. The world outside the brothel never let a woman forget who she was. Not for a moment. Even as she passed unnoticed through alleys and side streets, even when she wore her cloak low and her eyes lower, the weight of public shame pressed down on her like a stone she could never set aside. Judgment came in stares, in whispers, in silence, in laughter, in the pointed, careful way people stepped aside when she entered a shop or the way they simply refused to serve her at all, Victorian society, was built on respectability, on appearances, on the idea that virtue and womanhood were inseparable. A fallen woman, a phrase tossed about with a shiver of polite disgust, was treated not just as someone who had sinned, but as someone who had forfeited her very humanity. It didn't matter how she ended up there, whether she'd been orphaned, abused, widowed, or simply hungry. The public had no room for the details. A brothel worker was not seen as a person in difficult circumstances. She was seen as dirty. Newspapers, pulp fiction, and moral reformers all had their part in this performance. The public consumed stories of brothels with equal parts horror and fascination. Pamphlets warned good Christian families of the pollution that existed in their own neighborhoods, complete with lurid descriptions. Sin and filth. They called it moral decay. But what they never described were the women themselves, except as cautionary figures or anonymous fallen bodies. The pain was never theirs to explain. They were objects, metaphors, shadows. It was a deeply gendered. Shame. Men who visited brothels were rarely judged. Their sins were considered private lapses, forgiven with a shrug or a wink. After all, men had needs. Boys would be boys. But the women, those who made themselves available, were beyond redemption. A woman who strayed once, even under duress, might lose her place in society forever. No respectable employer would take her in. No boarding house would offer her a bed. No church would bless her with welcome arms. And so the shame was not just emotional. It was physical, structural, legal. A woman who wanted to leave brothel work found no ladders, no handholds. Her identity followed her like a scent one that lingered on her clothes, on her voice, in the very air around her. If a passerby recognized her on the street, he might spit. A shopkeeper might turn her away. Children might point. Her past, once known, sealed every door but one. And yet, inside that shame, there lived a quieter grief. It came out at night, when the makeup was off and the noise faded, when the day's wages sat folded under a pillow, and the aches of body and soul echoed louder than any man's footsteps. Some women stared at the ceiling and whispered apologies to no one in particular, to their mothers, their sisters, to the version of themselves that once dreamed of something else. Grief was the part they didn't show. Not in the parlor, not in front of the madam, and certainly not to the clients. It was hidden, buried, stitched behind the lace trim of their workday smile. Some had lost children, abandoned by necessity, or taken by force. Others had watched loved ones fade away, helpless to pay for care. Some had simply forgotten the sound of their own last name. That, too, was a kind of loss. A slow erasure? A life reduced to first names or nicknames: Dolly, May, Petal, words chosen not for meaning, but for appeal. Their real names, the ones spoken long ago by teachers or parents or siblings, became echoes. That forgetting was part of the grief, and part of the shame. Religion deepened the wound. Victorian morality wrapped sin and punishment in scripture. Reformers spoke of redemption, but only for the penitent, the broken, the truly contrite. Brothel workers who wanted salvation were expected to weep, to confess, to give up everything, and to live in penitence for the rest of their days. Some did. They entered religious homes, their heads shaved, their daily lives filled with prayer and labor. They traded one confinement for another. They were told it was grace. But many knew, deep down, that they would never be fully accepted. Not really. And those who stayed in the brothels learned to perform their shame for outsiders, even when they didn't feel it. It was safer to agree, to say, yes, I am ruined. Yes, I deserve little. Yes, I know what I am. This diffused the judgment. It made the client feel superior, made the charity worker feel benevolent. But inside, the woman might feel only quiet rage, or worse, nothing at all. The shame had hollowed out too much. There was no space left to care. Others hardened themselves against it. They refused the shame. They wore it like armor. Let them look, they'd say. Let them whisper. They walked through the market with chins lifted high, their cheeks Painted redder than ever, their dresses stitched just a bit tighter. It wasn't pride, it was survival. If the world was going to hate them anyway, they might as well give it something to stare at. But even those who performed confidence weren't immune. The shame had ways of creeping in, through quiet moments, through old letters never sent, through birthdays remembered but never celebrated, through the sight of a mother and child walking past, through a church bell in the distance. It was grief with nowhere to go. No funeral, no wake, no gravestone for the version of the woman who might have had another life. Sometimes the shame turned inward, slowly and cruelly. Women began to believe what was said about them, that they were nothing, that they had failed, that they were unclean. This belief did more damage than any angry glance or insult. It crept into their posture, into their voice, into the way they stopped dreaming. But not all of them surrendered to it. Some lit candles in secret, said prayers anyway, wrote poetry no one else would read, hid pressed flowers between the pages of an old book, smiled at a child on the street and remembered what it felt like. To be soft, they carved out small sanctuaries in the corners of a harsh world. They told stories to each other that didn't end in shame. They reminded themselves and each other that pain did not mean impurity, that being unloved did not mean being unworthy. The grief remained, but it was theirs. The shame clung, but it could be whispered away behind closed doors. Because they knew better than anyone that what society called ruined was often just surviving, and that survival, against all odds, was not something to be ashamed of. To understand the full weight of a Victorian brothel worker's life, you also have to look into the other half of the room. The man, the visitor, the client, because behind every transaction was a pair of hands reaching into a coat for coins, a pair of boots crossing the threshold, and a set of expectations shaped by Victorian manhood, class, secrecy, and hypocrisy. The world judged the women who sold intimacy, but it rarely judged the men who bought it. And in that imbalance, a great deal of suffering took root. The typical client was not always who you'd imagine. He wasn't necessarily poor, desperate, or depraved. In fact, many were middle-class clerks, professionals, soldiers, or even gentlemen, with top hats and polished canes. Some came alone, others in groups, laughing as they entered the parlor with the false bravado of men who needed to prove something. They came from drawing rooms, counting houses, barracks, and churches. Some had wives at home, some had mistresses elsewhere. Most had reputations to protect, and yet they still came. For many men, the brothel offered something that polite society denied them: unfiltered power. Here they could speak freely, behave crudely, act out desires they suppressed in public. In the rest of their lives, they were expected to maintain decorum, ambition, and control. But within those dimly lit walls, they dropped the mask. And the women who had no power to say no once the coin changed hands had to receive it all. There were clients who were gentle, who talked more than they touched, who cried, who wanted to be held rather than to hold. Some brothel workers preferred these men, lonely husbands, grieving sons, confused boys just barely out of school. These clients at least brought a kind of vulnerability. They apologized afterward. They tipped more. They said thank you. But there were others, many others, who came with entitlement, thick on their breath, who believed that their payment bought not just a body, but silence, submission, and safety from judgment. These were the men who barked orders, who laughed cruelly, who treated the women as no more than furniture that answered back. They paid to feel superior, and they left just as smug as they arrived. And there was hypocrisy in it. A man might spend his evening in a brothel and his Sunday in church. He might warn his daughter about the dangers of immoral women, while passing those same women on the street with a nod and a grin. Victorian masculinity allowed for these contradictions. It built a moral wall around women and handed men the key. Women were taught that virtue was their greatest possession. Men were taught that desire was natural, even noble. The result was a society where a man's lust was excused and a woman's survival was condemned. Some clients came not just for the physical, But for control, they wanted to dominate. They asked for things that couldn't be printed in newspapers or spoken aloud in respectable company. Some brought objects. Some brought expectations rooted in violence. And the women had no recourse. Refusing meant losing the fee, or worse, being beaten or blacklisted. The client would walk away. The woman would remain bruised in body and spirit, waiting for the next knock at the door. And still, they came. Some clients spoke kindly to the madam, shook. Her hand pretended the whole thing was a civilized affair. Some requested the same girl again and again. A sort of twisted relationship developed. They brought gifts, ribbons, sweets, a locket. They asked questions. What's your real name? Do you have dreams? Do you love me even a little? The woman answered whatever was safest. Yes, she might say, of course, you're different. She learned to say it with just enough emotion to sound convincing, just enough emptiness to protect herself. And then he left. And she washed her face, and the next man arrived. Clients didn't often think about what they were doing. The women were part of the atmosphere fixtures. They didn't wonder how many hours she'd worked, how many men she'd seen before him, how little she'd eaten. He didn't ask about her family, her health, or whether she'd ever had a night without pain. Some clients didn't even look her in the eye. They looked past her, around her, through her, as if acknowledging her humanity would spoil the illusion. There were rules, of course set by the madam, not the man. No violence, no bargaining, no lingering too long. But rules were only useful if someone enforced them. And most women knew, once the door closed, it was her word against his. And society always took his. Some clients were repeat visitors. Familiar faces, and sometimes that familiarity turned dangerous. Possessiveness crept in, jealousy, a sense of ownership. I always see you. I thought I mattered. Don't you remember me? If she pretended not to because it was safer, he might grow angry. If she did remember, he might demand more. Emotional labor piled up. The woman became therapist, actress, mother, lover, anything to keep the peace, to keep the money, to stay safe. And then, when he tired of her, he left. These same men might later condemn the very women they paid. They might tell jokes at her expense. They might marry a virtuous woman and never mention the hands they once held in shadowy rooms. Victorian men had the luxury of compartmentalization. The brothel was a dark chapter they could leave closed. The women didn't have that luxury. Their pages were read aloud, judged, and never forgotten. For the women, the client was both livelihood and danger. He brought the coin that paid for bread. And he brought the threat that might cost a tooth, a scar, a broken rib. He was not a savior, no matter what lies he told. He was not a lover, no matter how softly he spoke. He was a visitor, a paying guest. And once he left, the woman remained back in her room, back in her corset, back in the silence. And still, he would return. Again and again, because desire in Victorian England was allowed to be unspoken, unacknowledged, and deeply dishonest. The man desired. The woman carried the burden. The man paid. The woman paid more. He could forget. She could not. The transaction was always uneven, and when the newspapers printed stories of fallen women, the clients' names were never included. Only hers dot in the world of Victorian brothel. Endings came quietly. Not always dramatically, not usually with fanfare. Just quietly. A bed no longer occupied. A mirror not fogged by breath. A girl's name not called at breakfast. That's how they knew that something had ended. The question was always what kind. Had she left? Had she been taken? Had she died? For brothel workers, there were only a handful of endings available. And none of them were easy. Some women dreamed of escape, of walking away from the velvet curtains and oil lamps and musty bedclothes. They imagined starting fresh, somewhere far from the city's soot and judgment. They planned in whispers hidden coins, a friend's promise, a letter to an aunt. Sometimes it happened. Sometimes, late at night, one of them vanished. Her things gone. No word. Just absence. The others would notice, would nod silently over. Breakfast. She's gone, someone might say. Good for her, another might murmur. No more questions. Because asking could hurt, but escape wasn't always as clean as slipping out the door. Some were pushed out dismissed by a madam tired of excuses or unpaid debts. When a woman grew too sick to work, too bruised to smile, or too loud with her, brief. She became a liability, and liabilities were removed. Maybe she found another house. Maybe she ended up on the street. Maybe she was found days later, crumpled near the river or curled beneath a bridge. Disappearance could mean freedom or the first step toward a slower, colder death. Death itself came in different ways. Some women died from disease, slow and hollowing. Sexually transmitted infections like syphilis or gonorrhea could fester untreated. There were no antibiotics. Only patent medicines, harsh powders, bitter tinctures, and lies in glass bottles. A woman might waste away in her room, feverish, hallucinating, her hands clutched around the bedpost while the others listened from behind the wall. They brought water, whispered prayers, but most knew how it would end. Others died in childbirth. Because pregnancy, always a looming risk, brought its own dangers. Few brothel workers could afford a midwife. Fewer still dared to seek care in hospitals, where they were judged and turned away. And illegal abortions, quiet, painful procedures done with knitting needles or herbal poisons were risky. Some women didn't survive them. Their bodies couldn't recover. Their blood refused to stop. The madam might have them carried out before sunrise, dumped anonymously where no one would ask questions. Violence, too, claimed its share. Clients who went too far. A shove, a strike, a blade. A client who refused to pay and made sure she couldn't ask again. The law rarely intervened. If a brothel worker was killed, the constables made polite inquiries, but not much more. She was, after all, already ruined. Justice didn't visit their street. And then there were those who simply disappeared. No warning. Just gone. Perhaps they fled. Perhaps they were taken. Some were trafficked, moved from one brothel to another like livestock. Others were lured with promises, marriage, money, escape, that turned to nothing. Some may have ended up in foreign countries, renamed and reclothed, doing the same work under a different madam's hand. Some may have drowned themselves, or faded into alleyways, their last moments witnessed only by rats and moonlight. The women left behind didn't always mourn aloud. Grief had become a part of the job, another emotion to tuck away between the folds of a corset. But it was there in how they looked at the empty chair, in how they pressed a hand to the doorframe she once leaned on, in how they avoided speaking her name too quickly. There was a wordless ritual in it, a way of remembering without remembering too much. Sometimes the madam said nothing. Sometimes she lied. She left with a gentleman, she'd say. A good one. He'll take care of her. Maybe that was true. Usually it wasn't. But the lie was gentler than the silence. And so they nodded, sipped tea, turned the page. Few rare endings were happy. A client who truly loved her, who married her and gave her a house with windows and quiet. A distant cousin who took her in. A job in a laundry or dress shop where her past could be ignored. These stories were passed down like fairy tales. Not because they were common, but because hope needed a shape. And even one woman's escape made it feel possible. But most women didn't leave. They grew older, less desirable. Moved from brothel to brothel. Their bodies wore out. Their eyes grew dull. They worked until they couldn't, and when they couldn't, they were no longer useful. Some ended up in poor houses. Some died in alleyways. Some were buried in unmarked graves. The city never stopped to notice. The papers didn't print their names. Their funerals, if they had any, were quiet. Maybe a friend from the house came. Maybe not. Maybe a flower was laid. Maybe just dirt. The endings were not just physical. They were emotional. A woman could disappear in spirit long before her body failed. She might stop speaking, stop hoping. stopped caring whether the next client was cruel or kind. She became a shell, doing the work without resistance, without thought. Her ending wasn't a moment, it was a slow erasure. One night at a time, and yet, in the face of all that, there was still resistance, still tiny rebellions. A joke shared, a ribbon tied in hair, a song hummed in the washroom. These were their ways of saying, I'm still here. I'm still me. Even as they watched friends vanish, even as they wondered what their own ending would look like, whether anyone would remember their name, whether it mattered. For some, the ending came not with death, but with forgetfulness. The world forgot them, the brothel forgot them, history forgot them. But within the house, someone remembered. A woman years later might point to a corner and say, that's where Sarah used to sit. She had the prettiest laugh. Or, do you remember Lena? She could sew a hem faster than anyone. These memories, scattered and fragile, were the only gravestones most of them had, because in the end, there were three kinds of endings for a Victorian brothel worker. She might escape rarely. She might die slowly or suddenly, or she might disappear into silence. And in each case, the world moved on without her. But not always the women she left behind, they remembered, in silence, in song, in sorrow, because they always knew that someday someone would remember them too. Over the decades, as the dust of history settled over the Victorian age, a strange thing happened. The brutal, aching, lonely life of the Victorian brothel worker began to transform, not in truth, but in the public imagination. Slowly, uncomfortably, it became romanticized, turned into theater, painted in oils, told in novels, turned into costume dramas where velvet gowns shimmered, where boudoirs were lit by golden candlelight, and where fallen women winked from behind fans with playful, wounded wisdom. This wasn't reality. It was fantasy stitched from lace and lies. Writers and painters, mostly men, turned brothel life into a spectacle. They were fascinated by the mix of elegance and scandal, by the idea of a woman who lived outside of polite society's rules but still maintained beauty, wit, and allure. Brothels, in these imagined worlds, became salons of seduction, filled with clever courtesans in silk-sheeted beds. The suffering, the dirt, the disease, all of that was edited out. Rewritten, REFRMED. In literature, the brothel worker became a tragic heroine. In plays, she was clever, weary, and wise beyond her years. In paintings, she was reclining, often nude, posed with lazy sensuality and a faraway look. Her poverty became picturesque. Her pain became poetic. She didn't smell of cheap gin or sweat. She smelled of rosewater. Her bruises were invisible. Her clients were handsome. Her brothel was a velvet cage with music, laughter, and moonlight. And this is how the myth began to take root. Victorian novels helped feed the idea. In Dickens and others, the fallen woman was a central trope pitiable, maybe even redeemable, as long as she repented and died early enough to satisfy the reader's sense of moral order. Later, more sensational works added spice, brothel. Workers became spies, lovers of powerful men, women of mystery. Rarely were they shown simply as what most truly were young, desperate, trapped, and exhausted. This rewriting of their lives wasn't accidental. Society has long struggled with how to tell the stories of women who live outside its rules, especially sexual ones. And so, instead of facing the raw truth, people invented layers of fantasy to make it easier to look. The suffering became noble. The sex became art. The brothel became an aesthetic dot. By the 20th century, this myth-making only deepened. Films from the silent era through to classic Hollywood often portrayed brothel workers as glamorous, sassy figures in feathers and rouge, often with a heart of gold. The audience was meant to admire their spirit while quietly believing their downfall was inevitable. The complexity of real life was flattened into something palatable, marketable, safe. Even today, traces of that romanticization remain. In costume dramas, the brothel scene is often lit beautifully. The women laugh, flirt, command the room. Their choices seem empowered. Their world feels dangerous but alluring, bleak but somehow manageable. It's a fantasy people want to believe that. Brothel workers were always in control, that they used their sexuality to manipulate powerful men, that they found sisterhood and survival on their own terms. But history rarely matched the script. Most Victorian brothel workers had little or no choice. They weren't seductresses or secret queens. They were impoverished, often uneducated, frequently abandoned by family or society. Many had been abused or coerced into the trade. Once inside, escape was almost impossible. The glamour of red velvet. Curtains could not hide the harsh mattress beneath. The wit and wisdom came not from choice, but from necessity. The laughter, when it came, was a thin shield, not a sign of joy. The real brothel was cramped, hot in summer, freezing in winter, often filled with the stink of illness and unwashed skin. There were no endless closets of satin. A girl might own 2 dresses, one for show and one for sleep. She didn't sip champagne between clients. She drank gin to forget her last one. The men who visited weren't mysterious aristocrats. They were factory men, soldiers, drunk clerks, anyone with a coin and an hour to spare. And yet, modern retellings persist. Even when trying to empower the brothel worker, stories often slide back into fantasy. They try to rescue her by turning her into a heroine who chooses this life, who profits from it, who bends men to her will. But this too can erase the truth, because for most there was no will to bend. Only the next customer. Only the next day. It's tempting to rewrite suffering into beauty, to turn pain into poetry. But doing so costs us something. It costs us the ability to truly see, to understand what life was like, not for the imaginary courtesan in pearls, but for the girl with cracked hands and tired feet, staring out a window she could never afford to leave through. Still, we continue to romanticize. Why? Because the truth is heavy. It's not easy to sit with. It asks uncomfortable questions about power, about gender, about how society fails its most vulnerable. It reminds us that behind every fantasy is a body, and that body once belonged to someone with thoughts, fears, laughter, shame, and hope. To remember that is to disrupt the story, but if we forget the truth, if we let the myth become the only version that survives, we not only disrespect those women's real lives, we risk repeating the same silences. We risk telling new generations that suffering is fine, so long as it's beautiful. That exploitation is acceptable, so long as it's painted well. The myth will always be more marketable, but the reality difficult. And even heartbreaking is more important. Because the real women of Victorian brothels were not fantasies. They were not painted figures on velvet. They were survivors. And even if their voices were silenced in life, we owe it to them to remember their reality and truth, not just in myth. In the background of every Victorian brothel worker's life, often looming larger than even the madam or the client, were the reformers. Men and women, often religious, sometimes noble-minded, occasionally self-righteous, who believed it was their moral duty to rescue fallen women from lives of sin and degradation. They arrived with pamphlets, sermons, prayer books, and sometimes warm soup. They offered salvation. But salvation, in their eyes, came at a price of obedience, repentance, and permanent respectability. The Victorian age was full of contradictions, and none more than in how it approached prostitution. The very same society that relied on brothel workers to quietly absorb the sexual needs of men, also loudly condemned the existence of those very women. It needed the fallen to exist so it could feel upright. But it also wanted them to disappear when the story got uncomfortable. This is where the reformers stepped in, offering the illusion of a solution to a problem society itself had created. Some reformers were deeply sincere. They saw suffering and wanted to ease it. They opened Magdalene asylums or rescue homes, places where brothel workers could come to escape, repent, and learn respectable skills like sewing, laundering, or cleaning. Women who entered were often required to give up their names, wear plain uniforms, cut their hair, and live under strict rules. They were taught scripture. They were made to pray. They were warned constantly that they had lived in sin and that only complete humility would save them from damnation. In theory, these homes offered redemption. In practice, many were more like prisons. Entry was difficult. Many homes only accepted women under a certain age or those who showed the proper signs of remorse. Some required a referral from a clergyman or a letter from a family member. And once inside, the women were expected to conform absolutely. Questioning the system meant punishment. Speaking of their past meant shame. The focus was not on healing, but on erasing the brothel, the memories, the name, the body, and starting again as a humble servant of God. For some women, this structure provided safety. A clean bed, 3 meals, a break from clients. For others, it was just another cage. This one wrapped in holiness. They traded one kind of control for another. Instead of madams, they had matrons. Instead of clients, they had chaplains. Instead of lace, they wore starch. And they were reminded daily that they must never return to the world they came from, or they would fall again. And there would be no more grace. Still, the reformers were tireless. They held meetings. They raised money. They spoke at length about saving souls. Their campaigns often emphasized the purity of the woman before her fall. Once a daughter, a sister, a Christian, the pamphlets read. Now a slave to vice. These narratives centered on purity lost and purity restored. Rarely did they explore the complexity of why women entered brothels, poverty, coercion, abuse, abandonment. The woman's story was always simplified into a fable. There were men among the reformers, 2 clergymen, politicians, doctors. Some meant well. Some used the movement to boost their careers. They lobbied for laws that regulated brothels, that punished pimps and madams more harshly, and sometimes, though less often, tried to protect the women. But even among the well-intentioned, there was an undertone of control. The idea that a fallen woman could only be redeemed if she surrendered to the authority of good men. There was little room for a woman's own voice in this equation. Redemption, like everything else, was something done to her, not something she could choose on her own terms. Some women did manage to leave brothel work through the help of reformers. They became maids, nannies, laundresses. Their pasts were hidden, their names changed. But they lived with a constant shadow. What if someone found out? Respectability, once regained, was fragile. A whisper could ruin everything. And for those who never quite fit into the narrow mold of repentance, the door to normal life remained closed. And of course, not all reformers were gentle. Some homes were cruel, punitive, and deeply traumatizing. Stories exist of women being locked in solitary rooms for disobedience, of being forced to scrub floors with toothbrushes as penance, of being denied visitors, of dying inside those walls without ever seeing freedom again. Their pasts were treated like diseases. The cure was humility, suffering, and silence. Meanwhile, the society that funded these homes never questioned itself. It never wondered why so many women needed saving in the first place. It never asked why poor women were so easily cast out, or why brothels thrived in every corner of the city. It never asked why men who used those women were not sent to homes of repentance too. There were exceptions, of course. Some reformers who listened, who didn't judge, who truly tried to understand, who offered help without conditions, who offered new lives without shame. These were rare, but they mattered. Because for a woman with no options, even one open door could mean the difference between life and slow extinction. And then there were the women who rejected reform altogether, who refused to be pitied, who didn't want salvation from strangers, who found dignity, however fragile, in their own choices. They didn't want to be erased or renamed or purified. They wanted rights, respect, recognition. These voices, often drowned in the noise of sermons and good intentions, still existed. They reminded the world that not every brothel worker was broken. Not every woman wanted to be saved. Some simply wanted to live without being punished for it. But that was too dangerous for Victorian ears. It disrupted the neat morality tale. So instead, society clung to its myth. The woman falls. The reformer catches her. She repents, and all is well. The truth, as always, was far messier, and in that mess lived real lives, wounded, complex, unfinished. Not fables, not tragedies. Just women trying.